the silence in a courtroom right before a verdict isn't empty. It's heavy. It presses against your ribs, displacing the air until it's hard to breathe. But my chest wasn't tight because of the jury. It was tight because of her. Victoria Sterling stood across the aisle, a silhouette of sharp lines and expensive tailoring, staring straight ahead. They called her the Ice Queen for a reason. She didn't just win cases. She dismantled them with a surgical lack of emotion that terrified most men and alienated every woman who tried to get close. But as I watched her hand grip the mahogany table, knuckles white, I knew the ice was just a shield. And I was the only one wondering what she was so afraid of burning. The gavel fell, cracking the air like a gunshot. The trial was over, but our war was just beginning. I have always practiced law with my gut. I like people. I like their messy, complicated stories and the gray areas where life actually happens. Victoria Sterling treated the law like a sterile operating theater. For years, I had watched her operate from the other side of the aisle. She was brilliant, terrifying, and utterly alone. I remember the first time I tried to bridge that gap. It was after the Henderson verdict, a grueling 6-week trial where we had battled over every objection. I caught her in the marble hallway, the sound of her heels clicking a rhythm that sounded like a warning. "Good work in there," I'd said, offering a genuine smile, thinking maybe the end of the battle meant a truce. She didn't even break stride. She just adjusted the lapel of her charcoal blazer, her eyes sliding over me like I was a smudge on a window pane. "I don't fraternize with opposing counsel," she said. Her voice was low, smooth, and completely devoid of heat, especially not the ones who think charm is a legal strategy. She left me standing there, feeling foolish and fascinated in equal measure. It wasn't just me, of course. The rumor mill was full of stories about female associates she'd frozen out, brilliant women who thought they could find a mentor in her and found a wall instead. She dismissed us all, as if our very presence was a liability she couldn't afford. But I'm a defense attorney. It's my job to see what people are hiding. And I saw the things she thought she buried. I saw the way she checked her watch 3 times when the judge yelled, a tiny tick of anxiety she smoothed over instantly. I saw the way she pressed her pen into her legal pad until the plastic groaned under the pressure. She wasn't unfeeling. She was terrified of feeling the wrong thing at the wrong time. Then came the corruption case against Senator Vane. It was the kind of case that destroys careers. The district attorney didn't trust his own team. Too many leaks, too many political favors owed, so he did the unthinkable. He appointed a special prosecution team. Him, her, and me. Walking into her office for our first strategy meeting felt like stepping into a vacuum. It was on the 45th floor, glass and chrome, with a view of the city that made the people below look like ants. The air conditioning was set to a temperature that made me shiver in my linen suit. There were no photos on her desk, no coffee stains, just perfectly aligned stacks of files and the faint, sharp scent of bergamot and cold rain. It was a room designed to intimidate, to strip away anything human and leave only the facts. Victoria didn't stand when I entered. She was reading a file, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. "You're late," she said, without looking up. "I'm on time," I countered, pulling out a chair that scraped loudly against the floor, disrupting her perfect silence. "You're just early." She finally looked at me. Her eyes were a dark, arresting brown, intelligent and exhausted. "This isn't a game, counselor. Vane has connections that could have us both disbarred before breakfast. If we miss a single detail, we're done. I don't work with partners, and I certainly don't work with..." She trailed off, her gaze flicking to my slightly chaotic hair, my colorful scarf. "With women like me?" I finished for her, leaning forward. "Women who feel things?" The air in the room thickened, charged with that same electric tension from the courtroom. It wasn't hate. It was proximity. It was the friction of two opposing forces trapped in a box. With liabilities, she corrected softly. I need perfection. Can you give me that? I can give you the truth, I said. That usually wins. She held my gaze for a beat too long, her lips parting slightly, as if she wanted to say something else. Then she snapped the file shut. Fine, but we do this my way. No personal questions, no friendly drinks. We work, we win, and we go back to our separate sides of the aisle. Agreed, I lied. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind the assistant, sealing us in. The sound was final. We were locked in a cage together, and looking at the rigid line of her shoulders, I realized the danger wasn't just the senator. The real danger was what was going to happen in this room when the late night started and the armor began to slip. The timeline for the Vane case wasn't just tight, it was a noose. We had 3 weeks to sift through 5 years of encrypted financial records, meaning the concept of a workday ceased to exist. The sun became a rumor, something that happened while we were buried under mountains of discovery. The office became our entire world, a high-altitude capsule disconnected from the earth below. Victoria tried to maintain her borders. She had protocols for our coexistence that were as rigid as her spine. Files stay on the left, discussion is limited to the evidence, breaks are taken separately. She wanted us to be 2 processors running in parallel, never intersecting. But I'm not a machine, and I have never been good at coloring inside the lines. I started leaving my colorful gel pens on her pristine glass desk, bright neon disruptions in her grayscale world. I played jazz low on my phone, Coltrane mostly, until she stopped glaring at the device and started unconsciously tapping her pen to the rhythm. It was a silent war of attrition, my chaotic warmth chipping away at her sterile control. The shift happened on a Thursday, deep into the second week. It was past midnight. The city lights outside were blurring into streaks of gold and red against the rain-slicked glass. I had ordered takeout, Thai food, spicy and messy, and placed a carton on the corner of her desk. She stared at it like it was a biological hazard. I don't eat at my desk, she said, her eyes not leaving the spreadsheet in front of her. You don't eat anywhere, I countered, leaning back in my chair and popping the lid on my own container. The smell of basil and chili filled the sterile air, aggressive and alive. Your blood sugar is crashing, Victoria. I watched you miss that deduction on page 40. You're human. Fuel the engine. She looked at me, then at the food. The hunger won. She reached out, her manicured fingers hesitant, and took the carton. It was a small thing, watching the great Victoria Sterling eat pad thai out of a cardboard box at 1 a.m., but it felt like a victory. It was the first time she had let a physical need override her protocol. A tiny fissure in the wall. At 2 a.m., the high-rise office breathed differently. The aggressive hum of daytime faded into the low, steady bass note of the server room down the hall. It was just us, suspended in the dark, the silence amplifying the sound of rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I became aware of her scent. It wasn't the sterile soap smell of the hospital-like office anymore. It was her personal fragrance, sharp, complex, something like sandalwood and cold lilies. It was expensive, precise, and intoxicating. Then came the moment the crack widened. I had gone to the archives down the hall to retrieve a physical ledger. When I returned, the heavy glass door to her office was ajar. I didn't walk in immediately. I stopped. Victoria was standing by the window, her forehead pressed against the cold glass, looking out at nothing. Her blazer was off, the first time I'd seen her without that armor. Her white silk blouse seemed fragile against the darkness of the room. Her shoulders, usually so square and formidable, were slumped forward. Her hand was clutching her phone, white-knuckled, but the screen was dark. She wasn't making a call. She was recovering from one. Or maybe she was just recovering from the crushing weight of being Victoria Sterling. She made a sound, a small, jagged exhale that sounded dangerously like a sob. It was a raw, terrifying noise coming from a woman who treated emotions like evidence to be suppressed. My instinct was to rush in, to ask what was wrong, to offer comfort. But I knew her. I knew that if I acknowledged her weakness, if I caught her bleeding, she would wall herself off forever. She would hate me for seeing her. So I stayed in the hallway. I waited, my own heart hammering a frantic rhythm, until she straightened up, took a deep, shuddering breath, and smoothed her hair. Only then did I walk in, making enough noise with my heels to announce myself. I didn't look at her face. I walked straight to her desk and set down a fresh cup of tea. Chamomile, not coffee. I didn't say a word about the red rim of her eyes or the way her hand trembled when she reached for the ceramic. I just sat down and opened the vein file. Section 4 looks promising, I said, keeping my voice steady, professional. She looked at me. I could feel the weight of her gaze, searching my face for pity, for judgment. She found none. Just work. Just presence. She took a sip of the tea. Section 4, she agreed, her voice rougher than usual, stripped of its polish. Let's look. That was the moment the dynamic shifted. I realized then that she wasn't cold because she felt nothing. She froze everything because if she didn't, the sheer volume of what she felt, the pressure, the fear, the loneliness, would drown her. And for the first time, I didn't want to defeat her. I wanted to keep her afloat. The leak didn't start as a trickle. It was a dam breaking. We were 3 days into the discovery phase when the story hit the morning cycle. Someone had tipped off the press that Senator Vane's corruption trial wasn't just about money. It was about bodies. By noon, the courthouse wasn't just a building. It was a siege. From our window on the 45th floor, the crowd looked like a swarm of black ants, but the vibration of the news helicopters rattled the water in the glass on Victoria's desk. She stood up, buttoning her blazer with that sharp, definitive snap she used to close arguments. The mask was back in place. The exhaustion I had seen the night before was plastered over with foundation and cold resolve. "You take the service elevator," she commanded, not looking at me. She was shoving files into her briefcase with precise, violent movements. "I'll go out the front. They want a pound of flesh, and I'm the prosecutor. It's my job to bleed." "Don't be a martyr, Victoria. It doesn't suit your complexion," I said, grabbing my coat. "We walk out together, united front. If they see you isolating yourself, they'll smell blood in the water." She froze, her hand on the door handle. "I don't need a bodyguard, especially not one who wears floral silk to a war zone." "I'm not a bodyguard," I said, moving past her to open the door. "I'm your co-counsel. Move." We took the main elevator. As the doors slid open on the ground floor, the noise hit us like a physical wave. A wall of shouting, camera shutters, and the aggressive, high-pitched questions of reporters sensing a kill. The security guards were trying to hold back the line, but the press surged forward the moment they saw her dark hair. Victoria stiffened. It was a microscopic movement, a locking of the knees, a tightening of the jaw. To the cameras, she looked imperious. To me, standing 6 inches from her, she looked cornered. She started to step forward into the fray alone, her chin tilted up in that classic defiance. But the crowd was too dense, too hungry. A microphone boom swung dangerously close to her head. I didn't think. I just moved. I stepped into the gap between her and the mob, using my shoulder to create a wedge. I didn't shove. I guided. I used the same physicality I used in dance halls, fluid but immovable. I flashed a smile at a reporter I knew from the Metro beat, disarming him for the split second we needed to pass. "Back up, gentlemen," I said, my voice light but projecting clearly over the din. "Miss Sterling has no comment, but I love the enthusiasm." I placed my hand on the small of her back. It was a boundary violation, a breach of every protocol she had set. But she didn't pull away. Under the fine wool of her suit, I could feel the tension in her spine, coiled tight as a spring. I kept my body angled to shield her from the worst of the flashbulbs, absorbing the aggression of the crowd so she wouldn't have to. For 30 seconds, we were a single organism moving through chaos, her rigidity steered by my momentum. We reached the waiting town car. I opened the door, ushered her in, and slid in after her. The heavy door slammed shut, severing the noise instantly. The silence that followed was sudden and ringing. The driver pulled away, the car merging into the rainy traffic, leaving the chaos behind. The interior was dark, smelling of leather and the damp ozone of the storm. Victoria stared straight ahead, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked like someone who had just survived a bomb blast and was checking to see if her limbs were still attached. Then she turned to me. The look on her face wasn't gratitude. It was confusion mixed with a defensive, sharp-edged anger. "I had that handled," she said, though her voice lacked its usual steel. "You were about to get hit by a sound boom," I replied calmly, checking my phone for updates. "And you were hyperventilating. Don't bother denying it. I could feel your pulse through your jacket." She flinched, turning her face toward the window where the city lights streaked by in blurred lines of neon. "You shouldn't have touched me. You shouldn't have stepped in front of me. Do you know what the headline will be? Sterling weakens. Prosecutor needs defense." Or maybe, I suggested, it will be prosecution team unshakable. She let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "You don't get it. You get to be warm. You get to be the people's champion. Women like me, the moment we show we need help, the moment we let someone else take a hit for us, we are done. I have spent 20 years proving I am not a liability. I am not a damsel. I am the one who holds the sword." I turned in my seat to face her fully. The shadows cut across her face, highlighting the sharp architecture of her cheekbones and the genuine fear in her eyes. "Victoria," I said, dropping the professional veneer, "strength isn't about never needing anyone. It's about choosing the right person to watch your back. You aren't a liability, but you are human. And right now, you're not alone in that courtroom." She looked at me then, really looked at me. The anger drained out of her, leaving something raw and terrifyingly open in its place. The silence in the car shifted, becoming heavy with a sudden, acute awareness. We were too close. My hand was still resting on the leather seat between us, inches from her thigh. The adrenaline of the crowd was fading, replaced by a different kind of heat. The slow, heavy pull of gravity shifting between two bodies. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. And I wasn't sure if she meant the case, the partnership, or the way I was looking at her mouth. "Good," I said softly. "Then we'll figure it out." The car turned a corner, the streetlights washing over us one last time, sealing the pact in the dark. The distance between the seats hadn't changed, but the distance between us had vanished. The threat assessment came through an hour later, a brick through the window of my apartment and a credible digital trail leading back to Vane's security team. The district attorney didn't hesitate. He pulled us off the grid. The safe house was a nondescript brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined district that felt a million miles away from the glass and steel cage of the 45th floor. It was neutral ground. No paralegals, no press, no polished mahogany tables to put between us. Just a sparse living room, a narrow kitchen, and the heavy, suffocating silence of two people hiding from the world. We arrived separately, under the cover of darkness. When I walked into the kitchen, the sight of her stopped me dead in my tracks. Victoria Sterling, the woman I had only ever seen in bespoke charcoal suits, armor-plated and buttoned to the throat, was wearing a soft, oversized cashmere sweater the color of oatmeal. She was barefoot. Her hair, usually lacquered into a severe chignon, was loose, falling around her shoulders in dark, heavy waves. It was like seeing a statue step off its plinth and breathe. Without the heels, she looked smaller. Without the blazer, she looked touchable. The cognitive dissonance was so sharp it made my mouth go dry. She was standing by the stove, watching a kettle boil with the same intensity she usually reserved for cross-examinations. "The tea selection is abysmal," she said, without turning around, but her voice lacked its usual bite. It sounded tired. Human. "I brought my own," I said, setting my bag on the counter. "Jasmine pearls. I figured we might need something to calm the nerves." I moved into her space to reach for the mugs. The kitchen was small, forcing a domestic intimacy that felt dangerous. We were warriors, usually. We fought in open court with words as weapons. Now, we were just two women in a dimly lit room, listening to the hiss of gas and the rain against the window. I poured the water, the steam rising between us, carrying the scent of flowers and rain. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly, accepting the mug I offered. Her fingers brushed mine, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of static straight up my arm. She didn't pull away immediately. "Why are you so insistent on being here, on helping me? You know what they say about me. You know I've fired every female second chair I've ever had." I leaned back against the counter, blowing on my tea, studying her over the rim. "I know the rumors. They say you hate women, that you think we're weak." Victoria laughed, but it was a fractured, brittle sound. She looked down into her tea, watching the leaves unfurl. "I don't hate women," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I hate the mirror." She looked up then, her eyes dark and unguarded. "When I look at a young female associate, or someone like you, someone who leads with empathy, who wears her heart on her sleeve, I don't see weakness. I see the parts of myself I had to amputate to survive in this city. I see the vulnerability I can't afford. If I let you in, if I let myself respect that softness, then I have to admit that I'm starving for it. And I can't be hungry, counselor. Hunger makes you careless." The confession hung in the air, heavy and real. It wasn't disdain, it was fear. "You aren't an amputation, Victoria," I said softly. "You're a construct, a brilliant, terrifying construct, but the foundation is cracking. And maybe that's okay. Maybe you don't have to be made of steel to be strong. Maybe you just need a different kind of alloy." I reached out to take the file she had left on the counter, intending to change the subject, to give her an out. But my hand landed next to hers. I didn't move it. Neither did she. Her pinky finger grazed the side of my hand. It was the lightest of touches, barely a millimeter of skin contact, but it felt like a shout in the quiet room. My pulse hammered in my throat. The air around us seemed to thicken, charged with a sudden magnetic pull that had nothing to do with the case. She was looking at my hand, then up at my face, her lips parted slightly. The professional distance we had maintained for years had evaporated, leaving us exposed. "We should work," she said, but she didn't move her hand. "The vein files." "Right," I breathed, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "The files." But as we moved to the living room, the air had changed. We weren't just colleagues anymore. We were two people who had seen each other naked, emotionally speaking. And the hunger she was so afraid of, I could feel it radiating off her in waves. By 3 a.m, the safe house had transformed. It was no longer a neutral holding cell. It had become a sanctuary of shared purpose. The storm outside had intensified, battering the brownstone with a ferocity that made the world beyond the windows feel like a distant, drowning memory. Inside, the only light came from a single brass floor lamp and the glow of our laptops, casting long, intimate shadows across the room. We were working on the floor now. The coffee table had been abandoned hours ago, deemed too small for the sprawling map of Senator Vane's corruption we were piecing together. I was sitting cross-legged on the Persian rug, surrounded by bank statements. Victoria was on the sofa, leaning forward, her elbows on her knees, her hair falling loose around her face in a dark curtain. The hostility was gone. In its place was something far more dangerous. Synchronization. For years, I had fought Victoria Sterling. I knew her cadence in a courtroom better than I knew my own heartbeat. I knew exactly when she would object, when she would pause for effect, and when she would go for the throat. But I had never worked with her. I had never felt what it was like to have that terrifying, razor-sharp intellect aligned with mine instead of aimed at me. It was intoxicating. It was an intellectual aphrodisiac that hit harder than any drink I'd ever had. We weren't just speaking. We were finishing each other's logic. I would start a thought about a shell company in the Caymans, and she would complete the sentence with the exact statute needed to subpoena the records. It was a dance, fluid and effortless, a perfect suture of two opposing styles. My gut instinct and her rigorous precision were locking together to build the trap that Vane would never escape. "You see the pattern, don't you?" I asked, tapping a pen against a highlighted ledger. "He's not just moving money, he's moving leverage." Victoria looked up from her file. Her glasses had slid down her nose, and for the first time in history, she didn't push them back up immediately. She just looked at me, her dark eyes wide and unguarded in the dim light. "I missed that," she admitted quietly. 3 times I went through this ledger, and I missed the leverage angle because I was looking for the math. "You look for the rules, Victoria. I look for the people breaking them." She closed the file slowly, setting it down on the cushion beside her. The silence that followed wasn't about the case. It stretched between us, heavy and coiled, vibrating with the hum of the storm outside. "I have spent my entire career dismantling defense attorneys," she said, her voice low, stripping away the last layers of her professional affect. "I break them down. I find the holes in their logic, the weakness in their empathy, and I exploit it. It's mechanical to me." She paused, her gaze drifting over my face, tracing the line of my jaw, the messy state of my hair. "But I have never had to work this hard to keep up with anyone. I've never respected an opponent the way I respect you." The compliment landed like a physical caress. Coming from anyone else, it would have been professional courtesy. Coming from Victoria Sterling, it was a confession. It was an admission that I was her equal, that I had breached the fortress. "I thought you dismissed me," I whispered, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thin. "I tried to," she corrected. "It didn't work." Just then, a crack of thunder shook the house, violent and close. The lights flickered, once, twice, plunging us into near darkness before buzzing back to a dim, unstable yellow. The sudden shift in atmosphere isolated us further, shrinking the world down to just the two of us and the few feet of carpet between us. I didn't think. I moved. I unfolded my legs and rose to my knees, shifting my weight until I was leaning over the coffee table, invading her personal space, to point at a document on the sofa beside her. It was a pretense, and we both knew it. "Look at the date," I said, my voice unsteady. I was close enough now to smell her, that scent of rain and expensive sandalwood mixed with the warmth of her skin. My arm brushed against her knee. It was a casual contact that burned like a brand. Victoria didn't pull away. She didn't retreat into her ice. Instead, she leaned in. She turned her head, and suddenly her face was inches from mine. I could see the gold flecks in her irises, the slight parting of her lips, the rapid pulse fluttering in the hollow of her throat. She wasn't looking at the document. She was looking at my mouth. Her breath hitched, a sharp intake of air that sounded loud in the quiet room. It was a signal, clear and undeniable. The rivalry, the bickering, the years of courtroom warfare. It hadn't been hate. It had been this. It had been a desperate, subconscious attempt to keep a safe distance from the only person who could actually burn her down. "Victoria," I breathed, the name feeling heavy on my tongue. She didn't answer. She just held my gaze, unflinching, waiting for me to bridge the final inch of the gap she had spent a lifetime building. The morning sun didn't bring clarity. It brought the bill. The intimacy of the safe house, that fragile, terrifying closeness we had built in the dark, evaporated the moment we stepped back into the sterile, fluorescent light of the district attorney's office. The reality of the case crashed back in, and it brought a weapon I hadn't seen coming. We were 3 days from closing arguments. The evidence we had pieced together on that living room floor was solid, but it wasn't a smoking gun. It was a circumstantial web. To guarantee a conviction against a man as powerful as Senator Vane, the district attorney needed something absolute. And he found it. But the cost of using it wasn't money. It was me. I found out by accident. I was dropping off a revised witness list when I heard voices raised in the DA's private conference room. The door was cracked just enough for the sound to bleed out. I heard the DA's voice, booming, confident, dismissive. Then I heard Victoria's. It wasn't the sharp, commanding tone she used in court. It was quiet, strained. I pushed the door open without knocking. The scene explained itself instantly. The DA was leaning back in his leather chair, looking like a man who had just won the lottery. Victoria was standing by the window, her back to the room, her posture so rigid she looked like she might snap if the wind changed direction. On the table between them lay a single file. "Ah, counselor," the DA said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing the final strategy. Victoria has found a way to end this." I looked at the file. Then I looked at Victoria. She turned slowly, and the look on her face made my stomach drop. It wasn't guilt. It was devastation masked as duty. I picked up the document. It was a motion to introduce new evidence, a recovered email chain that proved Vane's guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. But the motion argued that the evidence was admissible only because the defense, meaning me, had negligently or maliciously suppressed it during the initial discovery phase. It was a lie, a fabricated technicality to bypass the statute of limitations. It would put Vane in prison for 20 years, and it would result in my immediate disbarment for ethical misconduct. "You found the silver bullet," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm in the ringing silence of the room. "You just have to shoot it through me to hit him." "It guarantees the win," the DA said, shrugging. "The senator goes down, Victoria becomes the hero who cleaned up the city, and you? Well, you were always a bit too colorful for the Bar Association anyway." I ignored him. I walked straight to Victoria, invading her space, forcing her to look at me. "Tell me you said no." She looked at me, her eyes dark and turbulent. I saw the war happening behind them, the ambition she had fed for 20 years, fighting against the woman who had almost kissed me in the dark. She was the Ice Queen again, rebuilding the walls brick by brick, because she didn't know how to live without them. "It's the job," she said. Her voice was hollow, a rehearsed line from a script she hated. "The mission is to convict Vane. This ensures the conviction. The greater good requires sacrifices." "Sacrifices?" I laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. "I am not a pawn on your board, Victoria. I am the partner who sat on the floor with you at 3 a.m. I am the one who saw you when you were invisible. Is that what this is? You were terrified of the connection, so you found a way to sever it professionally so you wouldn't have to deal with it personally?" "That is not fair," she snapped, the ice cracking. "You don't know what I have sacrificed to get to this chair. You don't know what it costs to be the only woman in the room for 2 decades. If I lose this case, I am finished. I become a footnote, a failure. And if you win it like this," I slammed the file down on the table, "you become him." I pointed at the DA. "You become just another suit who eats people to stay in power. I thought you were better than that. I thought you were real." "I am a prosecutor," she shouted, the loss of control startling us both. "I deal in verdicts, not feelings. I don't have the luxury of your moral purity." "Then you have nothing," I said quietly. The anger drained out of me, leaving only a cold, heavy disappointment. "You win, Victoria. You get the senator, you get the headline, but you do it alone." I turned my back on her. I didn't look at the DA. I walked to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I was done. I would fight the disbarment later, or I would leave the law entirely. It didn't matter. What mattered was getting away from the woman who had opened her heart just enough to show me she was willing to stab me with it. I opened the door. The hallway stretched out before me, a long, lonely path back to a life that suddenly felt very empty. "Goodbye, Victoria." I took a step, then A hand closed around my upper arm. It wasn't a polite request to stay. It was a desperate, bruising grip. I stopped, the air leaving my lungs. I looked down at her hand, her knuckles white, her manicured nails digging into the fabric of my jacket. It was the first time in 6 weeks she had initiated physical contact without an excuse. It was the grip of someone hanging off a cliff. I turned slowly. Victoria was standing there, breathing hard, her eyes wide and terrified. The mask was gone. The prosecutor was gone. There was only the woman, and she looked like she was about to shatter. The mahogany walls of courtroom 4B always smelled of lemon polish and old panic. But that morning, the air tasted like copper. It was the taste of adrenaline, sharp and metallic on the back of my tongue. I sat at the defense table, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles ached. I was waiting for the execution. The gallery was packed. Reporters, political fixers, the curious public, all waiting to see the district attorney's star prosecutor deliver the final blow that would bury Senator Vane and, collaterally, bury me. Beside me, my client was sweating, but I couldn't focus on him. My entire world had narrowed down to the figure at the prosecution table. Victoria sat next to the district attorney, her posture perfect, her profile etched in stone. She hadn't looked at me since we entered the room. She was staring at the judge, her face a mask of terrifying neutrality. The file, the one that contained the career-ending evidence against me, sat on the table in front of her. It looked innocuous, just manila folder and paper, but I knew it was a grenade with the pin already pulled. "Miss Sterling," Judge Patterson's voice boomed from the bench, cutting through the murmurs of the gallery. The prosecution indicated it had a final motion regarding the admissibility of new evidence before closing arguments. You may proceed. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room. I watched Victoria stand. The movement was fluid, elegant, and practiced. She buttoned her blazer, that familiar, sharp snap of fabric that usually signaled the end of someone's freedom. She picked up the file. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact, for the words that would label me unethical, reckless, a liability. "Your Honor," Victoria's voice rang out, clear and cool as a bell. The prosecution withdraws the motion. The district attorney's head snapped toward her so fast I thought I heard his neck crack. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, a sound like a sudden wind. My eyes flew open. Victoria wasn't looking at the file anymore. She dropped it back onto the table, not with reverence, but with a dismissive thud that echoed in the quiet room. She turned, ignoring the DA's hissed whisper of her name, and looked directly at me. Her eyes weren't cold. They were burning. "The state believes," she continued, her voice gaining power, filling the cavernous space, "that the evidence already presented is sufficient to convict. We do not need to destroy the reputation of opposing counsel to prove the truth. In fact, it is the integrity of this court, and the integrity of my colleague across the aisle, that allows justice to function at all." She had done it. She had just set fire to her safety net. She had chosen the harder path, the riskier path, solely to keep me standing beside her. The DA looked apoplectic, his face flushing a deep, dangerous red. But Victoria was already moving. She stepped away from the prosecution table, walking toward the jury box, effectively physically distancing herself from her boss, and aligning herself with the center of the room. "Senator Vane's corruption isn't in the details we missed," she began, launching into the closing argument. "It is in the silence he bought." I didn't wait for an invitation. I stood up. Usually, closing arguments are a duel. One side speaks, then the other. A back-and-forth exchange of blows. But this was a duet. I walked to the center of the floor, stopping a few feet from her. We weren't opposing counsel anymore. We were two sides of the same blade. When Victoria paused for breath, I stepped in, picking up the thread of her logic without missing a beat. "And that silence," I said, turning to the jury, was paid for with the city's future. Victoria nodded, her gaze locking with mine for a split second, a flash of pure, unadulterated connection. Exactly, she said. He bet on our division. He bet that we would be too busy fighting each other to see the architecture of his theft. But he forgot one thing, I added, my voice softening, drawing the jury in. He forgot that the truth doesn't care about sides. We moved around the well of the courtroom like we had rehearsed this for a lifetime. It was seamless. It was terrifyingly effective. I provided the emotional context, the human cost of Vinay's crimes, painting a picture of the victims. Victoria provided the steel, hammering home the statutes and the undeniable facts. We were weaving a cage around the defendant, bar by bar, using our different strengths to create something unbreakable. The energy in the room shifted. The DA had stopped glaring and was now watching us with a look of grudging, stunned awe. The jury was mesmerized. They weren't looking at a prosecutor and a defense attorney. They were looking at a unified force of nature. For 20 minutes, we held the room in the palm of our collective hand. It was the most intimate experience of my life. We were finishing each other's sentences, anticipating each other's pauses. It was intellectual intimacy so profound, it felt physical. Every time our eyes met, I felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the woman who had just saved me. When the verdict came back, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted. Reporters were shouting, the gavel was banging, but the noise faded into the background. I looked at Victoria. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling beneath the silk of her blouse, her cheeks flushed with the adrenaline of the win. She wasn't looking at the press. She wasn't looking at the judge. She was looking at me. And in that look, the last of the ice melted. There was no triumph over an enemy in her eyes. There was only the fierce, terrifying relief of a partner who had survived the fire. We didn't touch. We couldn't, not here. But the space between us was charged, heavy with everything we hadn't said yet. We packed our briefcases in silence, a comfortable, synchronized rhythm. We walked down the center aisle together, shoulder to shoulder. As we pushed through the heavy double doors and into the hallway, leaving the chaos of the courtroom behind, the energy we had contained for hours began to spill over. We had won the war, but looking at the way her hand brushed mine as we walked, I knew the surrender was just beginning. The door to her office clicked shut, heavier than any gavel. It sealed us into the glass capsule of the 45th floor. But the silence wasn't empty. It was vibrating. Victoria walked to the window, looking out at the city she had just saved, but her shoulders were shaking. Not from cold, from the crash. The adrenaline that had sustained us was draining away, leaving nothing but raw nerve endings exposed. She didn't turn around. She stood with her arms wrapped tight around her ribs. "I thought I could control it," she whispered. Her voice was unrecognizable, stripped of its courtroom resonance. "I thought if I kept the walls high enough, if I kept everyone at a distance, I would be safe. I thought I was protecting the work. But I was just protecting myself from being seen." I set my briefcase down. It felt like dropping a weapon I never wanted to lift again. I walked toward her, my heels silent on the plush carpet. I stopped a foot behind her. I could smell her perfume, that sharp bergamot, but beneath it, I smelled the reality of her, the heat of her skin, the exhaustion. "You weren't protecting yourself from being seen," I said softly. "You were protecting yourself from being loved because you thought they were mutually exclusive." She turned then. Her face was pale, her makeup like fragile armor. Her eyes were wide, dark, and terrifyingly open. She looked at me, and for the first time, she didn't try to look past me. She looked at me. "I dismissed them," she admitted, words tumbling out. "All the women who came before. The associates, the rivals. I pushed them away because every time I looked at them, I saw the softness I was trying to kill in myself. I thought it was weakness. I thought if I let it in, the structure would collapse. She stepped closer, invading my space. But you didn't collapse. You stood in the fire with me, and you didn't burn. You just got brighter. The distance between us was inches now. I could feel the warmth radiating from her body, a physical, magnetic pull. "I'm not going anywhere," I whispered. "I know," she said. The way she said it, like a verdict, broke my restraint. I reached out. My hand hovered, giving her one last chance to retreat. She didn't. She leaned into my touch as my fingers grazed her jawline. Her skin was burning. She closed her eyes, leaning her cheek into my palm with a sigh that sounded like surrender. "You're the only one," she murmured against my skin. "The only one who ever dared to stay." I moved my thumb across her cheekbone, tracing the sharp architecture I had admired for years. "I'm not leaving, Victoria. Not now. Not ever." She opened her eyes. The gold flecks in the brown were luminous. Her gaze dropped to my lips, then back to my eyes, a silent plea. I closed the gap. It wasn't a collision. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling of the world. I leaned in, giving her time to pull away, but she stepped forward. Her hands gripped my lapels, pulling me in. When our lips met, the world focused. It narrowed to the point of contact, the soft, terrifying pressure of her mouth on mine. It was a kiss that tasted of relief, of years of silence finally breaking, of a hunger starved for too long. She made a low sound in her throat and opened her mouth to me. The kiss deepened, becoming slower, heavier. Her hands moved to the back of my neck, fingers tangling in my hair, holding me like I was the only solid thing in a spinning universe. I pulled her flush against me, the feel of her body, solid, warm, trembling, overwhelming my senses. There was no ice left, only fire. Only the frantic beat of her heart against my chest and the taste of her on my tongue. We stood in the center of the office, surrounded by city lights, and for the first time, Victoria Sterling wasn't alone in the dark. She was burning, and she was letting herself burn. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, she didn't step back. She rested her forehead against mine, eyes closed, hands still gripping my coat. "I don't have a precedent for this," she whispered, her voice wrecked. "We'll figure it out," I promised, kissing her temple. Objection by objection. The morning light in Victoria's penthouse was unforgiving. It flooded through the floor-to-ceiling windows, stripping away the shadows we had hidden in the night before. Waking up there felt like waking up on the surface of a different planet, one where the oxygen was richer, sharper. I watched her sleep for a long moment before she stirred. In repose, the severe lines of her face were softened, the Ice Queen myth dissolved by the simple human act of rest. When her eyes finally opened, there was a split second of panic, the old instinct to reach for the shield, before her gaze found mine. The panic didn't vanish, but it settled into something quieter, something like wonder. "I don't have a protocol for this," she murmured, her voice rough with sleep. She pulled the sheet higher, a subconscious attempt to cover the vulnerability she had exposed. "Good," I said, resting my hand on the curve of her shoulder. "Protocols are for court. This is just existing." We drank coffee on her balcony, overlooking the city we had just conquered. The wind was cold, but neither of us moved to go inside. The silence between us had changed texture. It wasn't the heavy, pressurized silence of the courtroom, nor the loaded, electric silence of the safe house. It was the comfortable, grounded silence of two people who no longer needed to perform. "The district attorney is going to have a stroke," Victoria said, staring into the steam rising from her mug. "And the Bar Association will have questions. They'll say I compromise the integrity of the office. They'll say I let personal feelings dictate legal strategy." "Let them," I countered, leaning back against the railing. "We won. We put a corrupt senator behind bars because we stopped fighting each other and started fighting the problem. If that's a compromise, then the system needs more of it. Victoria looked at me, a small, wry smile touching her lips. You're an idealist. It's dangerous. And you're a cynic, I said. It's exhausting. We balance out. Getting ready for work that morning felt like a ritual. Watching Victoria Sterling put on her armor, the charcoal suit, the diamond studs, the perfect eyeliner, was a revelation. I wasn't watching her build a wall to keep me out. I was watching her dress for battle, knowing I was the one standing beside her in the trench. There was an intimacy in it, a shared secret. I knew the skin beneath the silk. I knew the rapid beat of the heart beneath the wool. We didn't take separate cars. We didn't stagger our arrival. We walked into the courthouse together, side by side. The moment we stepped through the metal detectors, the atmosphere shifted. The whispers started immediately. The clerks, the bailiffs, the other attorneys, they stared. But for the first time in her career, Victoria didn't speed up to outrun the gaze. She didn't freeze them out with a glare. She slowed down. She matched her stride to mine. They're staring, she said, her voice low but steady. They're terrified, I corrected. They just realized that the two best lawyers in the city are no longer at war. We reached the elevators. Usually, this was where she would pull away, reestablishing the professional distance. Instead, she shifted her briefcase to her other hand and let her fingers brush against mine. It wasn't a hold. It was a signal, a frequency tuned only to us. I used to think this kind of thing made you weak, she confessed, watching the floor numbers tick up, that needing someone was a crack in the foundation. And now? She turned to me as the doors opened, revealing the chaotic hallway of the 45th floor. Her eyes were clear, fierce, and undeniably warm. Now I know it's the only thing that keeps the building standing. We walked out into the fray, not as a scandal, but as a precedent. The gavel had fallen on our rivalry, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of us. We stood at the window of her office, watching the city move below. Two women who had stopped fighting the world and started fighting for each other. The ice had melted, but the strength remained. If you believe that love is the only verdict that matters, subscribe to Sapphic Legacy. Comment below if you've ever found your heart in the middle of a war.